Welcome to CGHE Seminar 139. I'm Oancea from the University of Oxford, and today's panel discussion is on the topic of global research in the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar asks how global research communities, including the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, are contributing to efforts to understand and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The discussion will also reflect on how research and researchers in different fields have been affected by the shifting priorities, aspirations, and demands in the current context. And we'll also focus in particular on the dynamics between collaboration and competition and on opportunities for positive change in research cultures. We'll be hearing from the University of Amsterdam's Giovanni Colavizza, Lancaster University's Gemma, Derrick, and the University of Oxford's Xin Xu. Each of the presenters will speak for about 10 minutes, after which we will have time for discussion. At the end of the hour allocated to the seminar, we'll keep the chat function open for another 30 minutes or so, and you will be able to continue the discussion with the speakers via the chat. But before we start, there are some brief housekeeping points to mention, and we'll share the screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CGHE website tomorrow morning. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted there. And we'll move on to the next slide. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or to ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do turn it on when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so that you can more clearly see who is talking. You can ask questions during the webinar or at the end of the presentations. Now, there are two ways to get my attention to ask a question. Firstly, you can use the raise hand button, which is found through the participants section. But secondly, you can get my attention or ask a direct question in the chat section. This option will be more effective during the presentations, as I will be able to follow the chat and pick up the questions being asked. Given the high number of participants to the event, you are more likely to be invited to ask a question if you do use the chat function. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Thank you. And if we stop the screen sharing, I'm now ready to pass over to Giovanni Colavizza, our first speaker, to start today's webinar. Giovanni is based at the University of Amsterdam, and before that he was at the Alan Turing Institute, where he was a co-investigator on the Living with Machines project and convenes the AI for Arts Special Interest Group. Giovanni is primarily working on AI for cultural heritage and on the public understanding of science. His recent publications include citation mining in the humanities and work on using bibliometrics to understand the history of the humanities. Giovanni, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the kind invitation from the organizers, and also to everybody that decided to tune in. I will say a few words about research on COVID-19, which is a rather broad topic nowadays. So in the interest of time and focus, I will pick two among many topics that we can, of course, find of interest. One is the volume of research being published on COVID-19, and in particular the role that preprints are playing, as well as the development of information retrieval tools, which are meant to support scientists to find and to make sense of all this scholarship that is being published. And secondly, I will say a few things about the topics of research as well as ongoing collaborations. So starting from perhaps an obvious but quite significant fact, the volume of research being published on COVID-19 has been staggering and quite unprecedented. This plot is visualizing the number of articles that are contained in a data set which is called COVID-19 and is maintained by the Semantic Scholar group, which contains articles about coronaviruses and COVID-19 going back in time as well as up to the present, with a particular focus on biomedical research. And we can notice that in this data set, the plot is updated to the early June this year. We have a really staggering amount of publications in 2020, more than 50,000. Now, to give you some perspective on it, we can compare it with another field of research, which is that of deep learning and artificial intelligence using neural networks. This is an area of research that has also been very popular over recent years and dates back to the 80s or even before. According to a report from Digital Science, in deep learning, we can find roughly 150,000 papers at the moment. So this means that research on COVID-19 just in a few months in 2020 has produced 1/3 of an entire field which is been growing a lot over recent years. And it is possible that by the end of the year, we will even surpass that. How is all this research being published? There is a very, very important role played by preprints. According to a recent article from Nature, preprints are accounting for roughly 1/3 of all these publications that we have just mentioned. So we have 1/3 of articles on COVID-19 that are currently published as a preprint and haven't been undergoing peer review, while 2/3 have been peer reviewed. So this is quite substantial, and in particular, it is significant because many different fields of research are using preprints, including fields of research that before were not using them very much. If we take a look at this plot, this is tracking the amount of COVID-19 preprints published per week over a variety of preprint servers. And we can see that preprint servers in biomedicine, such as medRxiv and bioRxiv, are playing a very important role. But we also have an increasing amount of preprints coming from other disciplines. For example, research papers in economics is growing quite a lot as of late. So many disciplines are using preprints to put their research out as soon as possible. And oftentimes this research then is not peer reviewed when it is used. And lastly, in terms of volume of research, I would like to mention that a lot of effort has been put in developing tools for scholars and also interested users to find information, scientific information on COVID-19 and to make sense of all this growing amount of publications. This example is taken from the Allen Institute of Artificial Intelligence and is called SpikeCord, but many more tools are being developed, which is also something that is, I think, quite interesting because the development of these tools have been happening before COVID-19, but it was somewhat slow, and now things are accelerating very much. So to summarize, there is a very large volume of research being published. It's quite unprecedented that on a single topic in such a short amount of time, so much research has been published. And to publish it, there is a very important role played by preprints, therefore research that hasn't been necessarily peer reviewed. And lastly, COVID-19 had also brought an acceleration in the development of tools to retrieve scholarly and scientific information. And I also believe that it's still quite too soon to say what will stay and what will go, but all these developments are very, very significant. To move instead to the second topic that I'd like to discuss, what is being researched. That is also quite interesting. This visualization is a term map from publications on COVID-19 up to the end of April 2020. And what we have seen in this study is that the main focus of all these publications, at least up until the first few months of 2020, has been the epidemic side of the crisis, as well as the public health concerns and countermeasures. So let's say the health crisis. Instead, what we are seeing more recently is a shift that moves towards the social and societal crisis. Therefore, a larger implication of different disciplines and a broader set of topics being engaged with, as well as, I shall say, also a strong focus on topics still in biomedicine, for example, the development of vaccines. In terms of collaborations among scholars and scientists, and again, referring to this report from Digital Science, we've seen that there hasn't been very many collaborations outside of national collaborations and so-called domestic collaborations. And the reason for that should be, or might be twofold. On the one hand, researchers have been using resources that were already in place, so teams that were already assembled, perhaps of other projects, in order to shift focus and start working on COVID-19. And secondly, this has a clear link with funding. So most funding calls have been at a national level and therefore have emphasized domestic collaborations. In terms of interdisciplinary collaborations instead, what we have seen so far is that the main focus of these interdisciplinary collaborations, when they happen, are between the medical sciences or the biological sciences and other disciplines. Collaborations across or among other disciplines that are not medical or biological are still in their infancy and they're still starting. So to summarize again on this topic, the initial focus of biomedical research on COVID-19 has been on public health and epidemics, as well as on transmission, and is now turning on vaccines much more. Other disciplines are also contributing as of late, and in particular, the shift is happening from a health crisis to a societal crisis and societal responses. Research has been primarily domestic in terms of collaborations and focused on collaborations between biomedicine and medical sciences with other disciplines. But it is also very likely that this picture will quite diversify in the near future as more projects will start. And to conclude, I would also like to underline that I haven't mentioned a lot of things that are ongoing and are widely discussed, including reviewing, and this is of course linked with preprints, as well as open access and the availability of these results, funding, the communication and discussion of research on social media, and last but not least, societal issues and the impact of COVID-19 on researchers. And I think in particular on this last point, other people will speak just after me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. This is a great range of issues that you've raised and also some interesting data, and we will return to them in the discussion later on. What we will do now is move straight on to the next speaker, and we'll reserve time at the end after all three have made their presentations for discussion. I noticed that people have already started using the chat to post questions, so please continue to do so. And also, I'd like to remind you that the webinar recording and the chat transcript as well will be available online starting from tomorrow morning, so that we can explore again all of those issues. I will now move to inviting Gemma Derrick to speak. And Gemma is based at the University of Lancaster. Her research concentrates on science and innovation policy and its impacts on the health system, the culture of academic knowledge production, and on universities more broadly. She specializes in evaluation systems in academia, in particular peer review, research evaluation frameworks, and university audit exercises. And currently, Gemma is involved in research on the role of gender and work-life balance in the productivity and reward systems of research, and on the influence of bias within evaluation processes. And her publications include her book on the evaluator's eye, impact assessment and academic peer review. Over to you, Gemma. Gemma, you are muted, I think.
Sorry, I was just saying I was going to share my screen.
There we go.
Nothing important missed at all. All right. I wonder if, can you see it? Is everything
Yes.
okay? Okay, so one of the things that I do a lot of research in at the moment is research culture. And I was actually talking to a colleague of mine a while ago when this all started, because it does feel like a while ago now, doesn't it? About, are we ready to COVIDize our research, of which both of us said, well, it'd be really interesting, but we're not in the mood to COVIDize our research because we're too busy living the effects of COVID as researchers. And so in the spirit of research culture, in the midst of the COVID epidemic, can I please just state a disclaimer that if a 5-year-old boy dressed as Captain America interrupts, can you please ignore him as much as possible? So I'm talking about research culture because research culture is very interesting for COVID-19, because for myself, when this all started, I was actually on a research visit in Spain and we were locked down quite quickly. And what I actually experienced was a lot of fear and a lot of, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? All of a sudden becoming a homeschooler as well as a researcher. But I experienced a whole lot of what I could only describe as kindness, which is all of these things that were happening in research globally that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily see during the normal times, the new normal not being something different. And that made me think about what research kindness means and what COVID experience is going to need for research culture post-COVID. And the funny thing about culture is that, as Giovanni pointed out, we're only really trying to see the effects of the COVID epidemic in different countries at the moment, and we're really not going to get a very full picture until after the COVID epidemic is ended. But we can get an idea about how research culture and research practice is changing. And can I just say, it doesn't look particularly beneficial, shall we say. And the problem here is that research is presented as a zero-sum game. It's something that you do to the exclusivity of everything else. So if you look at universities, there is always going to be a balance between research and teaching. So if you're teaching, you can't be researching. If you're researching, you can't be teaching. And the same sort of thing when you get an idea about what excellent research is in evaluation systems. It's either excellent or it's not. There is no real shade of grey between those two polar opposites. But now during COVID, what we're seeing is a choice, research engagement, a research culture being presented as a choice between personal life and work life, where you're either parenting and caring, and if you're doing that, you can't be researching, and if you're researching, you can't possibly be doing anything related to your your personal life. And what this does is it reinforces the fact that research positions itself as a choice between a game where you need to give up all between a world that is free of worldly burdens that prohibit your full engagement in research as a public good. And it also reinforces the idealized idea about what a researcher and academic is. And unfortunately, it seems to be male, white, and the sort of person that's free from parenting responsibilities or other worldly responsibilities that may prevent them from engaging in research full time. And there are already in the pre-COVID world existing disparities for a number of groups in research. My fear is that research culture, even though its initial reaction was to be kind and to try and support each other, that actually what is going to happen in the longer term is that knowing what we know about research culture and its resilience to change, these disparities that already exist are going to get bigger. And I'm going to explain and explore a couple of reasons why that might be the kind. So the other thing is that there is a polar opposite to here, which is research kindness, which we have seen in the initial stages of the COVID epidemic. And it's something that I've been unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but thrown into, even though I was resistant to COVIDizing my research agenda in any way, shape or form, is to try and define what research kindness is. And it's, it's not particularly easy. Research kindness, from what I see, is actively changing our individual behaviours to reduce existing disparities and to create a collegial working environment globally. And there's interesting ideas here. The one is that the link between changing individual behaviours, which assumes a type of awareness and a type of reflexivity in how our own individual working behaviours affect other people around us. And the rejection of research being a competitive game and being more collegiate, which is very difficult, and we've seen in the past that has been difficult to shake off. To actively do linking individual behaviours to a more community change that will have wide-on effects, but also, more importantly, is the global aspect of research. Research in different countries has different pressures when we're balancing personal and research lives, but these changes are felt globally to different extents. The other thing that we see is that our colleagues or our collaborators are also increasingly global, and which means that we also need to maintain a certain level of understanding about different cultures, different working conditions and different pressures as we try to create a collegiate work environment where we all produce knowledge that has some sort of public good further down the line. And what I've been seeing is mainly from my experience as a research director in my department, and seeing that how universities are responding to the COVID idea and what kind of pressures that's going to put on research endeavours further on. And this is linked to the idea that a post-COVID world is actually going to increase the disparities within research, rather than to what the initial idea was to create a better, more inclusive idea about what research kindness was going to be. And we see a lot of universities having financial pressures at the moment, where they're worried about enrolments for the next year. Here in the UK specifically, as well as other countries such as Australia and the US as well, where there is a reliance on international students, we find that universities are trying to make cost-cutting savings to the point where they will be able to compensate for the drop in international and domestic student fees. And what that means is that they put more effort into teaching and recruitment exercises to the detriment of time for research. Now, this is again assuming that research and full engagement in research is a zero-sum game. You either do research or you don't do research. And this also reduces the time that we have as individuals to exercise this type of research kindness through our own behaviours, because it leaves us less time to engage in those types of activities that make us a community in the first place, and such as peer review, mentoring, and actively changing our behaviour on an individual level to have this global change. There's also an idea about match funding. Unfortunately, university systems at the moment, with more emphasis on teaching and all the time that it takes to move teaching to an online or at distance format, means that there is less money to provide certain applications with match funding, which make them more competitive when it comes to the peer review process. And this advantages certain universities over other universities. Universities with large available capital are definitely going to still be in a position to provide suitable match funding, whereas other universities, it might actually cost them money to do research. Unfortunately, that is a cost that universities are not willing to bear at least in the short term. And what this means is that research culture change towards something that encompasses a greater idea about kindness is going to be probably seen as something that is a luxury, not necessarily, as I would argue, something that COVID-19 situation has given us the impetus to actually exercise and change right now. And you can see the sorts of other things that might be seen as a luxury that move toward a kind of more inclusive research culture. And this includes ideas and towards decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing research culture, as well as providing early career researchers and other vulnerable groups with the type of certainty that they need to be able to visualize a world on the other side of COVID. And the other thing that unfortunately is that old habits die hard. Research and researchers are traditionally resistant to change, and there is there is an idea that getting used to the new normal means that we need to continue with business as normal, business as usual, without understanding that the pressures that are facing individual researchers to practice research are also changing, and this makes it increasingly difficult to perform business as usual that we would have in a pre-COVID world. There's a little understanding in an environment that puts financial pressures over cultural change to be able to accommodate the type of understanding individual researchers need, with the having to face their increased pressures on their individual personal lives, and balance that with the expectations of a research career or a competitive research career. And we see that as well. I mean, Giovanni pointed to preprints as a very interesting way of analysing perhaps or estimating what the effect of COVID will be over a long period of time for individual research areas. But the same is also seen for these vulnerable groups in academia, one of them being women, of course, women who take up a larger proportion of caring and or parenting roles during COVID lockdown. And the longer that the lockdown continues, the more this disparity will be affected. And this is a paper that was published in Nature quite recently, which basically showed that the proportion of preprints coming from women who are authors in the first couple of weeks of the COVID epidemic are actually decreased to the same sort of preprints with females as authors that you would have seen a year ago. And this is actually, again, we will not be able to estimate, or we will not be able to understand the effect that COVID-19 is having on individual researchers and their ability to practice research until the end, whenever that happens, of this crisis. But we are seeing these disparities that existed in research actually growing over time, and the longer that this epidemic and the necessary changes people are needing to make on an individual level just to perform in research extend into the future. And I know a lot of universities are watching this with eager eyes. The argument there is that perhaps instead of watching it, we should be perhaps making significant changes and moves towards changing the culture right now so that we are better prepared for a more inclusive research culture in a post-COVID-19 new normal world. So my last question is kindness possible post-COVID? I'm an optimist, and I would probably like to say yes, it is. But culture change is something that takes a long period of time and also needs, in effect, individuals to actually want it to change as well. We will be monitoring this. Culture change is something that happens over time and is mapped over time. And this is going to be a very interesting research area as we emerge into the new normal, whatever it looks like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma, for the very important issues that you've raised. There's a number of questions already gathering on chat, so please could everyone continue to do so. We will now turn to our final speaker for today, Xin Xu. Xin is a member of the Center for Global Higher Education and is based at the University of Oxford, where she was also a Clarendon Scholar. Her expertise includes higher education, internationalization and globalization, and research on research. Recent publications include work on changing governance of higher education in China and on incentive programs for international publications in the humanities and social sciences in China. She has also commented recently on science during the COVID-19 crisis. Over to you, Xin.
Thank you, Alex. I'll try to share my screen. Zip, is it?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Alice, and thank you, Giovanni and Gemma, for excellent presentations. Following on this trend of discussion, I will broadly review the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on global research community. And I'll focus on challenges and changes in the following 4 aspects. While listening to my presentation, I invite you all to reflect upon those changes and try to perhaps use your imagination and try to picture how our future global research will be look like. And to start with, in terms of research networks, we can see evidence both for collaboration and competition. As Giovanni has excellently explained, the international research collaboration continues, but not on a large scale, together with interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, and multilateral cooperation. On the other hand, competition is still very important. For instance, the global competition and race for the COVID-19 vaccine is a telling example of how science needs to negotiate with the intrinsic pursuit of knowledge, individual interests, institutional benefits, global public good, commercial values, and geopolitical issues. I won't be able to elaborate on the geopolitical issues here, but if you're interested, there's another great panel lined up on this topic in July. And next, in terms of the equality of research here, I'm talking about the relationship within research communities. It can be between humans, such as between researchers and ourselves with participants, colleagues, stakeholders, or it can be a relationship between non-human existence, such as with knowledge, data, and publications. And the first thing we're witnessing is how scientific world is embracing the culture of open science, sharing data, preprints, publications, sources openly, freely, and rapidly online. But questions remain, as Giovanni also pointed out, like how long will this sustain? Because the current open access seems to be relying on the founders and publishers who are kind enough to lift up the paywalls on a temporary and COVID-limited basis. And in addition, there are also questions about how the openly shared data and publications could sometimes be misinterpreted or misused, such as using those preprints that have not gone through the scientific peer review as solid evidence that fit into some conspiracy theories or to serve as clickbaits for the media. And the next observation is how the research community is showing resilience, solidarity, and the culture towards humanism. This is very much in line with Gemma's presentation and her paper and other academics' observations, such as the slow caring scholarship as argued by Xu. I think the culture of accountability seems to be temporarily giving way to a more humanistic approach, where researchers are perceived and seen as humans. Therefore, we emphasize on the well-being of researchers rather than seeing researchers as producers of research output and pushing for performance, numbers, or productivity. Well, for instance, the 10-year evaluation clocks have been postponed in many US universities, and also the REF, Research Excellence Framework evaluations in the UK has also been postponed. But we should note that those evaluations are just postponed, they're not canceled, they'll be back after the COVID-19. As for research life, well, firstly, we can see a combination of physical immobility and disconnection and virtual mobility and connectivity. I think this is redefining the concept of and approaches to international partnership and international events. The focus of international collaboration has been shifted from an emphasis on the movement of people and equipment to the emphasis on cross-border flows of data, information, and knowledge. And online events like our CG webinars have increased the inclusivity, accessibility, and cost efficiency of such events, and also making those events more environmentally friendly, if you think all the travels that have been saved. However, there are also concerns that some groups without pre-existing and established networks will be further marginalized because they don't have access to international conferences. And also, there are also concerns over the digital privacy and security of all those virtual events. And in terms of inequality, I echo with Gemma's observation that it is true that we're all in this together, that we're all experiencing the COVID pandemic and crisis all together. But on the other hand, we're not all in this together. Academics are weathering the same storm, but under different shelters. following up with Gemma's observation, I think there are so many factors that are contributing to the inequality, such as depending on researchers' gender, race, ethnicity, faith, social class, health condition, caregiving responsibility, discipline, institution, career stage, administrative or teaching role, and country and place of birth, and also country and place of residence. And I think the inequality is not only showcased by the declined research productivity of the paper published within certain groups, but also by the negative impacts on their short or long-term financial status, job security, career development, physical health, and also mental well-being. And also the pandemic didn't create the inequality, but only intensifies it. Underlying the tip of the iceberg is pre-existing and institutionalized injustice in global research, with imprints of managerialism, performativity, discrimination, othering, marketization, and perhaps the politicization of research. I argue that the issues of inequality we're witnessing are just symptoms, and only treating the symptoms is not enough. It is a system that needs further treatment and perhaps restructuring. And the final observation is on research ethics and impacts. While there are new and intensified ethical concerns over the rigor, integrity, quality, impact, risk, and value of conducting research with adjusted methods in such a crisis. And this is not only for research community, but also for our participants, for funders, and for the wider society. For instance, as the emphasis on making urgent impacts may marginalize some research areas, perhaps in the humanities and social sciences, while other research fields with potentials for immediate impacts become predominant, better acknowledged, and well-funded. In addition, although research has been drawing attention from the public and government everywhere, to what extent has the research generated positive societal impacts? And to what extent has the research been communicated and used responsibly? And to what extent has the research been trusted, or will research be trusted? Answers vary across countries and institutions, media channels, and the public groups, and some are better than others. So what's next? Well, personally, I think we're standing at a crossroad of our past, present, and future. So we're carrying historical baggages with us into this current crisis, and our current experiences will be marked in history books and looked back upon by our future generations. So at this point, all the changes can be present and temporary, but decisions to keep them or not will be transformative. Then I have a few questions. So what will the new norms be? And will things change now be forever transformed? Or will they exist only as a COVID limited edition? And also, after witnessing how the global research community can jointly contribute to the humankind, how can research be understood beyond a zero-sum game, but as a global common good? And also, after seeing those potentially positive changes, how can we sustain those changes and rebuild a global research community that is open, equal, ethical, and kind, robust, sustainable, humanistic, diversified but collaborative, responsible, and trustworthy? Well, I understand there's no immediate answer, and I echo pretty much with the previous two speakers that we're still seeing those impacts and changes and not sure what they will lead us. But addressing some of those questions will require long-term vision, structural changes, and also collective commitment from all. So I have a final question for all of us. So what do you think are the roles of us as academics? And here I quote a Chinese philosopher and scholar, Zhang Zai, who was born exactly 1,000 years ago. And I quote his view on the responsibility of academics as to establish conscience for the world, to secure the well-being of humankind, to develop knowledge building on passages scholarship, and to build eternal peace and harmony for our future generations. I mean, there are certainly different kinds of views and different ways of thinking, but so I invite you all to perhaps pause a bit and take some time and reflect on your own positionality and the way you perceive yourself as to be serving. And with this note, I'll end my presentation today. Thank you all for coming and listening, and thank you colleagues and friends for insights and comments. Thank you, Trevor and Simon, our freelance, our CG Comms Officer and Director, for making this webinar possible. I look forward to further discussions with you all.
Thank you very much, Xin, for the very thoughtful presentation and the important questions that you've raised. We've got quite a list of questions now bubbling away in the chat. So we'll see how far we can go with through those questions. Please note that if we don't manage to get through every question, the chat function will remain open for about 30 minutes after the end of this first hour of webinar, and you can continue the discussion with the speakers via that means. So I'll start by inviting questions from Anwar Rumjan, Shilpi Ghosh, Phil Richards, and Vasiliki Papatsipa. I think the first three were immediately directed at specific speakers, and then Vasiliki's question is broader, and probably I will invite some comments from each of the three speakers. Please, when you are asked to speak, to ask your question, please remember to unmute your mic and to activate your camera, and also to introduce yourself. And I think Anwar's question is directed at Giovanni. Anwar, may I invite you to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Alice. I'm Anwar Ramjon from the Mauritius Institute of Education, very far away. It's almost 6 o'clock in the afternoon here. So my question is about, it's related to social science research, which is about the researcher engaging involving with subjects in the community to collect data which relates to ethnographic research. So in this pandemic era or post-pandemic era, how will this evolve, this type of research, which involves immersion of the researcher in the community? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Giovanni, would you like to comment or to try to answer on this question?
Yes, I can try. I could also use help. Well, I think this is a great question. I think it's very relevant, and we know that this kind of research, like ethnographic research, is extremely important, and also takes a little bit more time to be deployed and to come to results than research that is purely data driven. So there is a motivation that is due to that, by the fact that maybe it's still ongoing, but also there is a clear challenge that you probably are hinting at in terms of social distancing, and the fact that immersing ourselves in communities and with people will be extremely complicated going forward. So I believe that's an open challenge. To some extent, it is possible to engage virtually, but that is of course not the same thing. So maybe if I speculate, I can imagine that in the future we will work more in terms of trying to do ethnography research in virtual environments. And then secondly, I think, and I hope that at least in some situations and under safe conditions, this work will still be able to be done, because it's very important. And the fact that we don't see it, I also hope that is, it takes a little bit more time to do this kind of work than other approaches. So I hope it is happening.
Thank you. And I think the next question is probably directed partly at Giovanni, but also overlaps perhaps with some of what Gemma was saying. So I'll invite Shilpi Ghosh to ask your question.
Hello, sorry, I can't unmute my video.
That's all right. We can hear you.
First of all, I want to thank you. Hi, I want to thank you all for this wonderful webinar. My question, I like to question Giovanni. He has given us the statistics on the very nice presentation, saying that how many research has done in various fields, especially on the biological part, on the physical part. So I want to know that how many research, what is the impact, how many research have been done already on the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of the various, maybe the first line, the doctors, the police, or the children of the doctors and police and other people also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So back to you, Giovanni.
Well, I can reply briefly, also because I don't want to monopolize the Q&A, but that I don't know. And I would suggest what I would do is to try to use some of these tools that are out there to do a search that can be quite fine-grained. I know for a fact that what I know is that there are projects that are doing that. I don't know if they already have results, but I don't know what is the current status of that research, I'm afraid. I don't know if Gemma maybe has more.
Would you like to come into this question, Gemma?
Can you just remind me of the question? That would be good, sorry.
I just want to know that how many researches have been done on the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of the people, particularly on the first line workers, and also, you know, on the children of the first line workers. I mean, particularly the doctors, the medical healthcare service providers, as well as the police.
I don't know of any research going on at the moment because I concentrate mainly on research culture rather than health researches per se, but I know that there is an ongoing conversation here in the UK at least about mental health and that the exhaustion of the frontline workers, specifically those ones who work in the NHS, but also there is a wider conversation around the well-being of children and balancing the risk of long-term mental health damage for children as well as their parents versus the risk of long-term educational disparities if they continue to miss out on school. So it's not really my area of the research, but I know the discussion is happening, and but if you just DM me afterwards, direct message me afterwards, I can provide you with some people who are doing some research onto that area if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Gemma. May I remind everyone, after you've asked your question, please remember to turn off your mic so that we don't hear lots of things at the same time. I'm going to bring in Phil Richards now with a question that I think might come your way, Xin.
Thanks, Alice. Lovely to see you again. I'm Phil Richards. I used to work in the Department of Education and am now happily retired from the admin job that I was doing. So my question was for Xin. Your slide, which mentioned collaboration and competition in the search for vaccines, interested me because I know there's lots of research happening to get a vaccine, and I'm interested in whether the collaboration that you're talking about is sort of, is there a tension between that and the competition to get a vaccine? And is that tension helpful, or is that hindering the process of getting a vaccine and collaboration across different institutions in different countries? Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent question. So in terms of the vaccine for the COVID-19, it's I can see both a combination of collaboration and competition, perhaps predominantly competition, particularly between different countries and different research groups, because as you probably know, there are so many research groups that are developing vaccine, and they're all based on different kinds of data set and different kind of methods. So there's a possibility of one or more that could develop the vaccines. But on the other hand, there's some collaboration in terms of sharing the open data. So if you go to, for instance, I think it's on WHO's website, and you can find the latest information about each vaccine development. And you can see like what kind of data set they're based on and what kind of methods they're using. So it's not like we're closed in our rooms and building these competitions, but it's an open sort of perhaps benign competition that is an open call to our researchers. But also there's another concern is that the vaccines, they're also closely tied to commercial values and also perhaps ideological and political agenda. That after if a research group has developed the vaccine first, there's also a question of trust in the vaccine and whether that is applicable to all the people around the world and whether that will be recognized or trusted by all the organizations. But I think on the positive side, there are rhetorics of developing vaccines for the public common good and not like making huge profits temporarily from those vaccines, which is showing sort of a temporarily positive sign in this competition.
Thank you very much. We're moving now to some broader questions which may be connected to one, two, or all of the presentations. So I will start by inviting Vasiliki Papatsiba to ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you, Alice. Thanks to all CG colleagues for convening this wonderful webinar. Thanks to all the speakers. So trying to see if my camera is on. Oh, here it is. Apologies for the delay. Yes, I think it's something that came from all three presentations. When you were speaking, you mentioned that national collaboration was mobilized faster. So that made me wonder whether internationalization of research is something always remains work in progress, as if we can quickly revert back to earlier stages as never been fully done. So what does that tell us about the nations? Do they maintain or even increase their advantage by mobilizing financial resources and existing managing structures? Sorry. So that was the comment or question, and if you would like to enlighten us on this point.
Thank you, Vasiliki. There's also a follow-up question on Vasiliki's in the chat, which is about whether there is a difference between, in terms of research outputs and international collaboration patterns between centralized and decentralized research systems. So who would like to comment? Please turn on your mic. Yeah.
Sorry.
Xin, please. Yeah.
Sorry. So just very briefly, I think under this COVID-19 pandemic, there's a growing trend that the countries are sort of taking a larger control over the society, and we see that almost in every country, a need for securing the public health and to implement the strategies quickly. So I would think that there's a potential for the governments and countries and nations to be grappling those power, at least at this stage. And in contrast to like other source of powers like markets or others.
Thank you. Gemma or Giovanni, would you like to come in? Gemma, please.
I would a bit, if that's all right. And this is taking in a bit of a historic perspective, mainly because, as we said, this is happening right now, and I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. So saying anything definitive is very difficult. But if you look back to another pandemic, if we can remember, perhaps it wasn't as strong in the Northern Hemisphere as it was in the Southern Hemisphere. And Simon, you can probably back me up on this. 2009, 2010, the swine flu epidemic reached the Southern Hemisphere before it reached the Northern Hemisphere. I was actually working in an A&E department at that stage, treating swine flu victims. And what actually ended up happening in terms of collaboration is that a lot of the basic research was done in the Asia Pacific region and in Australia, because they were the ones that were facing it at the time. But the vaccine development aspect, a little bit more downstream, was actually dominated by the Northern Hemisphere, because the idea was that the southern winter, which was the northern summer, meant that we would be hit with the pandemic more than the northern hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere obviously keen to have a vaccine in line prior to their winter, which is when they would hopefully avoid the majority of the pandemic. And so what you actually saw is a very big divide between the North and the South in terms of what type of knowledge they created towards the end goal of creating a vaccine. And that was very much divided along what country or group of countries in this side saw as their most immediate concern. And there was a lot of international collaboration, but for those countries that were not experiencing the pandemic in real time, it was something that they were hoping to prevent in the future. Their engagement in the research was actually concentrated on more downstream outputs than the like the sequencing and the diagnosis and the idea for diagnosis that was definitely done on the southern side. So there was a level of collaboration, but it was very nationally based and actually built on what each country saw as their most immediate need in order to most appropriately respond.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I think, well, time is flying, so I think we only have time for one more question. And the next question in line is by James Robson. So I'll ask you to ask your question, James. Interestingly, there are two other follow-ups on your question, one from Claudia Sarico and one from Rosemary Dean. So let's see if we can ask all of them as a block, and then I'll invite each of the three speakers to comment. So James first.
Thanks, Alice. I'll be very quick. My question is really about the concept of kindness, but in particular relation to casualization and the growth of precarious contracts in the research community. I think that's partly being caused by the funding structures that encourage precarity. And so when we're talking about kindness, is that really the right language? Should we really be talking about revolution, activism, in order to build back better in the context of research, and actually start restructuring the problematic structures that exist?
Thank you, James. Is Claudia Sarico able to ask her question as well as a follow-up?
Yes, so I think funding structures are obviously an issue, especially the move to project-based funding relative to core funding. But from the work that we're doing on research careers, there's also the issue of culture and institutional practices from those hiring those postdoctoral researchers on fixed-term contracts, for instance. And in many systems, we see actually a rise in funding income, including core funding, but still an increase in hiring people on fixed-term contracts rather than on open positions. So the issue of kindness here is very relevant, but not just at the level, of funding structures, but also at the level of the practices that occur and the imbalance between elite researchers and PIs and those on their teams supporting the research, and the number of these people is increasing, and the conditions they work in are also deteriorating. So that's an interesting debate as well.
Thank you. And finally, Rosemary Dean.
So my question is about basically doctoral researchers, because I think they are particularly badly affected at the moment, because some of them can't get into labs, some of them can't do their field work, some of them are part way through things, but they can't get any more data collected. And I think, you know, as much as some of the things we talked about are kind of might make them feel better, they don't actually achieve anything. So I think this is a question about how we support those doctoral researchers through what is a very difficult period. And it's particularly difficult for, if people are quite near to the end of submitting, then they probably can manage, even though there might be all sorts of things going on in their lives, which makes that difficult. But if you're kind of in your second year of a full-time doctorate and you suddenly see that everything you were planning to do has disappeared, then that's really, really tricky. So what do we do about that? Because that's quite a serious issue. It relates to Claudia's point as well, but it's particularly about doctoral education that I'm interested in.
Thank you very much. So is kindness the right concept? How about precarity of research careers, and how do we avoid a missing generation of early career researchers, in particular in relation to doctoral researchers? I'm going to ask each of the three speakers to share their thoughts. Who would like to start?
I will.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm already on mute. The kindness thing. Yeah, this was something that I am still dealing with when I'm trying to think about what kindness means. The difference between kindness and revolution is that kindness begins on the individual level, and it means that we need awareness about our own behavior, how it affects others, when our behavior is for wider good, for the good of a particular group, or potentially for our own good. And this so revolution I see is something that perhaps would be more community-based, that perhaps follow a little bit more downstream than kindness itself. Kindness is when we actually say, you know what, I'm not going to be the douchebag that I think I'm doing, and I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to actively change my behavior because I know there might be a lost generation of researchers, or I'm going to actively change my behavior so that doctoral researchers are going to be able to navigate a COVID world, so that they don't have, so they aren't held back too far. So kindness is about every single one of us really examining our own behavior and trying to understand how we can change it in order to reduce disparities, but also make research a nice place to work. Nice being the worst word I could possibly use. But the difference between kindness and revolution is perhaps on what level it acts.
Thank you. Should we move on to, would you like to come in, Giovanni?
Sure, very, very briefly. I think these are extremely important topics that, yeah, as someone just suggested, probably weren't a webinar on their own. Just to say that I think what James, Claudia, and Rosemary highlighted is, in my opinion, not just something that is situational to COVID-19, but these are structural problems in academia, precarization and power structures that are really becoming problematic, are ongoing issues since decades, and they are just becoming increasingly bad. And COVID-19, what COVID-19 is doing, as with the volume of publications and many other things, is just accelerating trends that are very bad. So I think solutions should be systemic and should be structural as well. And perhaps this can be taken as an opportunity to finally do something about it.
Thank you. And finally, Xin.
Thank you very much. I think those are all very important questions that we need to ask ourselves, and also for the research community and the research structure. So on the one hand, I think it's indeed structural problems we're facing. And as I said, all the things we're witnessing are just the tip of the iceberg, but the structure need to be changed. But on the other hand, how to change the structure and where to start from. I really like Gemma's idea of kindness in a way that it emphasizes academics' own agency about the things we could do by ourselves. And also I was thinking about the idea of water. You know, water is very soft and fluid, but on the other hand, it's also very strong if it like collect and goes together as a river and as a sea, or at a waterfall. So I think there are also power behind the kindness. We could change the structure in radical ways or in gentle ways, or like start from academics ourselves and to have these ripples perhaps around us and to change our micro environment and to the meso and macro environment.
Thank you very much, Xin. And thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you to the speakers for the answers. And I'm sorry, but at this point we're already over time, so we'll need to move towards a close. Apologies, there's a long list of questions still waiting, and apologies to those who won't get to ask their questions live. I've got, they include Angelo Salatino, Simon, Pao Sheng Chang, Victorica Trif, Pavan, Kela, Tugay Jurak, and Maud Ahmed. So I'm sorry that we don't have the time to have all of those questions live, but we will keep the chat open and the speakers will remain on chat so that the conversation can continue using the chat function until 1:30. Thank you very much, Giovanni, Gemma, and Xin for your excellent contributions to today's webinar, and many thanks to Trevor for organizing the event. Thanks everyone for your contributions. As I think has already been pointed out in the chat, there will be a range of seminars building on today's conversation. Please, could everyone turn off their mics for the time being? So there will be seminars building and picking up threads from this conversation, and also there's a seminar series for earlier career researchers organized by CGHE. All of the webinars, including the one from today, are recorded, and the recordings and chat transcripts are available at the link that Trevor has already shared on the chat. And maybe Trevor, you could post it again near the end of this conversation so that everybody has it handy. And that brings us to the end of the live webinar. Please stay on for another half an hour. But for now, thank you, and we'll see you next time.